And so Bhante ends up being in Kalimpong at a time when there's a real kind of an unusual mixing of Buddhist traditions. So he's been ordained as a Theravada monk, quite sort of traditional, one of the earliest schools of Buddhism, robes, lots of rules, shaved head, etc. But then these sort of Tibetan mystics are coming over the mountain with quite a different point of view, sort of the Tantra, quite different ideas. And over the years, the 14 years that Bhante is in Kalimpong, he ends up with different teachers, Tibetan teachers, a sort of Chinese Chan teacher, Yogi Chen, as well as some of his Theravada teachers. Very unusual, and also for other people around this time, it does mark a change generally in the sort of Buddhist makeup of the world, in that traditions start to blend in a way that they never used to. So you'd have had Theravada Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, Zen Buddhism. But books are becoming more available, more affordable, people are swapping ideas, people are travelling more when it comes to the 1560s, so the ideas start to blend. And Sangharakshita Bhante is very much the kind of inheritance of that kind of world. Around this time, he writes a pretty hefty book called The Survey of Buddhism, which is still well regarded generally in the kind of Buddhist academic world as a sort of trying to get to the bottom of what do all Buddhist schools have in common, what is the essential Buddhist thought. Sort of looking for the sort of unified path, or the Buddhism essentials that unifies Buddhism as a tradition. It's very kind of scholarly work, but quite kind of deep and well articulated. So there's this real sense that Bhante, right from the beginning of his sort of Buddhist career, is interested in what becomes one of the 6 distinctive emphasis of Triratna, our movement. The emphasis, and I can never quite say this right, so let's give it a go. Ecumenical. Got it, yeah. Ecumenical approach. So an ecumenical approach does not identify exclusively with any particular Buddhist school or tradition. It embraces the whole Buddhist tradition and seeks to learn from and be inspired by its different aspects. So that's one of the 6 distinct emphases. In a way, with this talk, what I'm going to try and do is talk about the early years of Bhante Sangharakshita, bringing Buddhism to particularly London to begin with, and how these 6 distinct emphases of Triratna are formed very early on. And so one of our distinct emphasis in our tradition, one of our 6 principles, if you like, is an ecumenical approach. And you can see that you just sort of see it sort of in his bones by being in Kalimpong at that time. You pick up that kind of approach. Even before that, he'd been widely reading. Bit naughty for a Theravada monk to be reading Tibetan texts and talking about meditation practices with Tibetan teachers and Chinese teachers. It's not really what you're supposed to do. Okay, so then in 1964, he'd gone to India in 1947 and become a monk in 49. So quite a bit later, in 1964, he's invited by a small number of Buddhist groups that were operating, again, particularly in London. So particularly the Buddhist Society and the English Sangha Trust, who run at that time Hampstead Buddhist Vihara. He's particularly invited because there's an element of those 2 groups are not getting on that well with each other. They're not getting on that well with each other, so they think, let's invite the senior-most English monk. Let's see if we can get him from Kalimpong. Yeah, so at this stage, Buddhism is very germinal in the UK. Maybe there's 150, 200 people calling themselves Buddhists, and most of them, it's quite an academic pursuit. It's quite based on, I've bought some books, and they're really interesting to me, and so I've gathered with some other people who have some books to form a library, and we're the early Buddhists of London. What Sangharakshita ends up doing, I think, is he brings not only this sort of seniority, like, oh wow, an Englishman who's a monk, he brings a sort of depth of experience, even a sort of like visionary energy, and a sort of boldness that I don't think the 100 or so English Buddhists were expecting. He starts giving pretty electrifying talks that you can still listen to on Free Buddhist Audio online. So in sort of 1965 and 66, he gives talks called things like The Texture of Reality, The Mystery of the Void, Is Religion Necessary? The Expanding Consciousness of Meditation, Buddhism versus Psychoanalysis. Quite kind of like, I don't know, quite meaty. They're pretty good. You really get this sense of someone who's sort of on fire with inspiration and really wants to bring the sort of essentials of the Buddha's teaching to a new world. You know, you can imagine people in the late 60s, they're pretty interested in the void, man. What's the texture of reality taste like? You know, it's that kind of vibe. And he's sort of talking to them, just like the Buddha would have done. So in the stories of the Buddha, you encounter this enlightened being who meets a farmer and then uses farming metaphors to explain how to work on his mind. And then he meets a king and uses the language of treasures to talk about how to work on the mind, or meets a poor person and talks about, do you see what I mean? Sort of matches the audience. The enlightened mind just sort of talks to the person in front of them. There isn't Buddhism doesn't really end up with set teachings or set rules. It's a responsiveness of a sort of enlightened being or a more developed being to someone in front of them. And I think you really see this in the early years of Bhante sort of bringing Buddhism to the West. Like, I don't think in India he was giving a talk called Buddhism versus Psychotherapy, for example. But in the late 60s, that was probably quite an interesting topic. Probably quite an interesting topic now, actually. At this time, he also, in quite a lot of these talks, he starts particularly emphasising the value of the arts, particularly in its broader sense of sort of culture, literature, poetry, paintings, philosophy, sort of creative thinking. There's even this moment where he receives this letter inviting him back to the UK, where he doesn't really want to go. He talks in his memoir of, like, quite happy with this life in Kalimpong in a way. I've got my routines, I've got what I'm up to, but it sounds like I might be needed in the UK. So he starts thinking he might go, and then he reflects how sort of India is something of his spiritual home. That's where he's sort of been ordained and been taught. But there's this reflection that he gives that's something like, oh man, I can't do it. I was going to paraphrase it in a weird voice. Sort of this, basically this reflection that England is his cultural home, particularly in terms of artistic. So he thinks about the poets that he reads and the music he would listen to and the novels he's read. He's very inspired by William Blake, particularly the Romantic poets, for example. And so there's this sense of, it's almost like there's this reflection that there's a spiritual home and there's an artistic home or a cultural home, and both have significance and somehow need to work together, or maybe they're the same thing. He ends up giving a talk a bit later that becomes a book called The Religion of Art, which is all about the place of beauty and aesthetics and art in the sort of the rising up of consciousness. Anyway, so I think in these early talks you can also start to see what a second distinct emphasis of Triratna emerge, of the emphasis of the arts, the importance of arts and culture in a Buddhist life, in a life that's trying to sort of grow up, a mind that's trying to become more refined, more beautiful, transformed. I think in these early, quite exciting, quite electrifying talks, I'd really listen to them. In my experience of listening to these early talks, it's quite odd because I really do think they're electrifying and sort of pulsating with energy, and it's really exciting. And he talks like someone from the Victorian era. It's like quite slow, quite pacey, lots of pauses. I have been guilty of listening to it on 1.5 speed, for example, which is probably very unreverential as a disciple, but it's sort of, there's this slow pace, there's this mindfulness, there's this deep reflectiveness, thoroughly sort of Buddhist, what you'd expect, but there's this sort of pulsing, energetic heart with quite exciting ideas. Quite ecumenical, one of the 6 distinct emphases of our tradition. And yet also there's this sense of really emphasising the arts and philosophy and sort of culture, what's culturally alive at the time. During those first few years of being back in the UK, as well as, he's giving lots and lots of talks, leading a few retreats. He starts particularly emphasising the mindfulness of breathing and the metta bhavana as 2 practices to emphasise. He also starts sort of, in a way, sort of adjusting his lifestyle. So he's been a Theravadan monk. You're not supposed to handle money. You're not supposed to have possessions. You wear robes. You shave your head. Around this time, he stops shaving his head and actually gets very, very long hair. And in one picture, has sort of like these like pretty nuts mutton chops, great big bearded sideburns and long hair, but still wearing the robe. He starts wearing rings. Later on, he does a little bit of experimenting with LSD because that's what everyone's up to. So there's a sense of he really sort of embraces the world that he's found himself in. Particularly the sort of audience that are coming to the talks of the kind of Buddhist mystic person, whatever they're thinking at the time. You get this sense of him sort of embracing that world. He's been in the Indian world as an Indian Buddhist, as it were, in robes, following those rules, and then he sort of becomes a bit more swinging 60s. Particularly there's some images of him with loads of rings and mutton chops and long hair, still wearing these robes, but he starts to accessorize them. I'm sure it's all much deeper than that. I think he's sort of getting in touch with dormant energies that he's probably left a bit quiet for the 20 years that he was a sort of very well-behaved, disciplined kind of monk. He writes about it later, that at times he felt pulled apart by this, what he calls Sangharakshita 1 and Sangharakshita 2, a sort of romantic, poet, high energy, emotional Sangharakshita 1, and Sangharakshita 2 are sort of disciplined, sort of following the rules, sort of really wants to do things properly. And I think there's this moment in these early years of him being in London where he sort of plays around with that a bit. He talked a bit about enjoying disappearing into central London and being anonymous. No one knows he's the special Buddhist person that's been in India for 20 years. And he talks about drinking a pint of Guinness and just really enjoying being in a normal place. He also at this time begins a friendship with Terry Delamere, which he writes quite extensively about in his memoirs. There seems to be something about Terry was both interested in the sort of Buddhist world and all of these things that Sangharakshita might know, and sort of treats him like a normal bloke. There's sort of this sort of somehow is able to look up to him but also be friendly. And so there's a few months where they spend quite a lot of time together. In the end, they end up touring Europe together. Actually, Terry is in quite bad mental states. He's very depressed. A few years later, he goes on to kill himself. At that time, Sangharakshita writes a letter about, that he talks about still thinking about Terry all the way until his death, many decades later. But so I think there's this sense of, with this friendship with Terry, he sort of becomes a bit more normal. There's talk of them reading books together, sort of hanging out together. Probably quite a funny sort of friendship to witness. And later on, that sort of comes up. So there's a very pivotal moment actually when Bhante, when Sangharakshita and Terry are both visiting Kalimpong again a few years later. I can't do all the dates and timeline, it'll get really boring. He's in the UK for a while and he goes back to India for a visit. And while he's in India, he's touring around with this friend Terry and a few other people. And he gets a letter. And I thought I'd just read you the 2 paragraphs from his memoir about getting this letter. One of the first letters to be opened was from the English Sangha Trust. It was dated 1st of November and was signed by George Goulston in his capacity as one of the directors of the Trust. After assuring me in the most fulsome terms of the Trust's deep appreciation of my services to Dharma in England, he went on to inform me that in the opinion of the Trust and my fellow order members, my long absences from Hampstead Buddhist Vihara, together with what he described as my extramural activities, were not in accordance with the Theravada's high standard of discipline and ethics. Moreover, I had not comported myself in a manner fitting the religious office that I held in the order. The Trust had therefore decided to seek elsewhere for an incumbent of the Vihara. As my work in India was so dear to my heart, the letter continued blandly, I might think that my allotted task was to remain and serve Buddhism in the East. Should I, on careful reflection, consider that my work lay in the East, this would be acceptable as reasonable grounds for my resignation, and notification to this effect would be made to the Buddhist authorities in the West. Should I not feel disposed to take this step, the trustees would feel regretfully obliged to withdraw their support from me. In doing so, they felt they had sure the agreement of the Sangha in England. And there's this moment where Sangharakshita says, "Do you know what this means?" I asked Terry when I finished reading the letter. "It means a new Buddhist movement." The words sprang spontaneously from my lips. It was as if the trust letter, coming as it did in a flash of lightning, had suddenly revealed possibilities that hitherto had been shrouded in darkness or perceived by me only dimly. Though I had long felt that the Buddhist movement in Britain needed a fresh impetus, and had even discussed it with the Three Musketeers, which are three friends that are helping him run activities, the feasibility of my giving lectures and holding classes outside the orbit of the Buddhist Vihara, I had certainly never considered the possibility of taking a step so radical as starting a new Buddhist movement, whether in Britain or anywhere. But I now saw that a new Buddhist movement was what was really needed, and the trust letter had opened the way to my starting it. The movement I was to found some months later had been born in London, but it was conceived there in Kalimpong on the 24th of November 1966, at the moment when I addressed to Terry those 6 fateful words. So in a way, I think the English Sangha Trust, I mean, well, I'm now a follower of Sangharakshita, so I quite like him. I think he's exciting. But actually, the English Sangha Trust were kind of right. They were sort of basically saying, well, you're not really wearing your robes properly. You're a bit radical. You've got this very close friendship to a man. We're not sure about that. It is the late 60s, after all. We think there might be more to that, and we don't like it. So that's the sort of thinly veiled bit. So they're sort of on their terms saying, we don't want you to come back. Please do. You're nice. It's quite English as well. We'd be very great. You know, if you decide to stay there, that would be wonderful terms for your resignation. Very sort of English. You know, do let us know in writing. Type it up nicely. And then you get this sense of Bhante quite spontaneously, and it does seem to be that way. He's been asked about it later. It was only really at that moment where he thought, well, I have to go back. I've got these connections. I've got these friends. I've been giving these talks. I've been leading these lectures. I was meant to be going back. I'm not now just going to stay here. But there's this, again, this sort of a rising of energy, particularly thinking about this talk of bringing Buddhism to the West. This sort of title of the talk is a bit like that wasn't quite the plan, but it just sort of ended up kind of happening, coming through him, particularly by certain conditions. Anyway, so he comes back from Kalimpong. That extract was from November 1966. And the next year, in April 1967, he founds the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, the FWO. Quite bold, because the Western Buddhist Order doesn't exist. So he sets up a movement called the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order. They're friends to an order that doesn't exist for a whole year. And then the next year, there's the first ordinations, and thus the Western Buddhist Order comes into being. Yeah, so the movement is founded as the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order in 1967, and then there's ordinations a year later in 1968. Now, the first ordinations in 1968 are really well documented. There's several news articles, but also there's a recording. So currently at Adasthana, there's a kind of exhibition, and one part of the exhibition is you can listen to the recording of this first ordination. You can press buttons to listen to each bit. Really remarkable. And one of the reasons why there was so much interest at the time was that, I can't remember the number, it's something like 10 people, 8 people, something like that. But crucially, one of them is a woman. And that is quite unusual. And so there's, in all of the newspaper articles, that's what they're interested in. They're not really writing about, you know, how exciting, there's a new Buddhist movement. They're like, oh my God, there's a woman being ordained. Isn't this amazing? Some think it's less amazing, some think it's great. And there's a very famous photograph of that moment of her, I can't remember her name, I'm afraid, getting ordained. But what it means is it's quite well documented by sort of news people turn up and someone wants to record it, etc. Really moving, I found, listening to the ordination, the recording of the ordination at Adasthana, quite crackly, but almost identical to my ordination 50 or so years later, almost identical, which I think is remarkable. That this ordination ceremony was sort of brought into being. and then remained the same. It's only a year and a half after he receives this letter where he decides, right then, we need a new Buddhist movement, and then somehow, from somewhere, from him or somewhere else, I don't know the dynamics of wisdom, this ordination ceremony is created that remains the ordination ceremony that we use now in Triratna, pretty much. And the third of the 6 distinct emphasis of Triratna that I'm trying to get through in this talk is that of being a unified order. So Triratna, the Western Buddhist order, is later renamed in 2010 to Triratna, is a unified order, meaning that it's open to all, and it's got a sort of single unified ordination. So there is the Dharmachari ordination, so myself and Vajramitra and Prasadasara and Kusala and others, but that's who's here, have taken the Dharmachari ordination, become members of the Triratna Buddhist order. It's open to all, it's a single ordination, there's no then hierarchy, you don't later get a sort of bishop's ordination or something like that. It's one single ordination and then you live your life from there. And crucially it's unified in terms of it's an equal ordination between men and women, still close to unique, not quite, but close to unique in the Buddhist world to have an ordination that has the same status for men and women. Even more radical to have women giving that ordination to women. And it's an ordination that's neither monastic nor lay. So it cuts through these traditional categories of Buddhism in Eastern countries, where you have sort of monastic people and normal people, monks and lay people. So our ordination is neither monastic nor lay. The ordination itself takes place in 2 parts. You have a private ordination, you have a public ordination. In the private ordination, you take the 10 ethical precepts. You're given a name by your preceptor, so I was given the name Ksantikara, a maker of patience, he who is a maker of patience. And you receive a sadhana, you receive a practice based on a Buddha figure. Could be the historical Buddha, it could be Green Tara in my case, it could be Padmasambhava, all sorts of Buddhist figures. So in the private ordination you receive a name, 10 ethical precepts that you commit to, and you take on a sadhana, a Buddhist figure to meditate upon. Then there's a public ordination ceremony, usually a few days later, where you take the 10 precepts again, just to really hone the importance of ethics in the Dharma life. You chant the acceptance verses of with loyalty to my teachers, in harmony with friends and companions, for the attainment of enlightenment, for the benefit of all beings, I accept this ordination. And then you're also, a kesa is placed around your neck. So kesa comes from the Japanese Buddhist tradition of a kind of abbreviated robe. It comes from the tradition of early monasticism where as part of your ordination, you'd be handed your robes, they'd be folded and you'd hand them to someone, you'd pick them up, and then because there's nowhere left to put your belt for the robes, they'd put it around your neck. So it means you'd be handed the robes, and then the belt would be put around your neck. You go to a side room, a green room if you will, and get changed. So that moment of placing the kesa around somebody's neck is then that moment of ordination. It comes from this ancient tradition of placing the belt around the neck. So it's a single unified order where that's the single ordination. And this brings us to another aspect of Triratna's kind of distinct emphasis that is being formed in these early years of bringing Buddhism to the West, which is the centrality of going for refuge. So there's one ordination, there's one commitment, and what it marks is an effective going for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So there's an effectiveness of your turning your life towards the ideals of enlightenment, truth, and a particular kind of friendship based on shared ideals and sort of growing up together. And on the basis of that being kind of witnessed by others who are going effectively for refuge, that's sort of witnessed and marked, and you become ordained. Does that make sense? I'm doing the very shorthand version. So that means that ordination then isn't so much a particular kind of status or a particular kind of lifestyle or a particular way to behave. Ordination in our tradition is a marking of an effectiveness of practicing a Buddhist life. There's this sense of, okay, it can be witnessed now that you are meditating well enough, you've got good connections with others who are practicing, you've got this kind of heart wish to move towards the Buddha, to move towards enlightenment, you're sort of up for it, there's a sense that you can do it, you're doing your best, you're not quite there yet, but it's the moment. Yeah? So there's quite a sort of radical change in sort of bringing Buddhism to the West, sort of slightly, almost like ditching the split between monastic and lay, between people who are really doing it and people who do it part-time, and saying what it's really about is going for refuge to the Three Jewels. Thoroughly traditional. Again, when you look at the stories of the Buddha in the Pali Canon, people meet the Buddha, be they a farmer or a king. Some of them aren't into it. There's a very famous story of, I think it's the third person the Buddha meets after his enlightenment, where he meets Dona, and Dona says to him, who are you? What's your Dharma? Who's your teacher? And he says, I'm a Buddha. I'm enlightened. And Dona says, may it be so, and carries on walking. So you get the sense of like, good for you, I'm going to go over there now. So some people not so into it or don't quite resonate. Other people, they meet the Buddha, there's a bit of an interaction, sometimes at a doorstep, sometimes in a wood, in a farm, and they have this sense of this complete, earth-shattering, shaking kind of communication where their life changes. And the form in the stories is always that they say, to the Buddha for refuge I go, to the Dharma for refuge I go, to the Sangha for refuge I go, and then thus they're kind of a Buddhist. They're then a follower of the Buddha. So our ordination tries to get back to that moment of, on the basis of a sort of heart response to these ideals of enlightenment, truth and community. There's this sort of shaking and this, in that direction I go. I'm trying to explore quite big ideas quite quickly. So again, quite different. So in this mission, if you like, or in this mood of bringing Buddhism to the West, which you might notice, really, I'm mainly talking about bringing Buddhism to London. I haven't really got past that point. So we could have called this talk Bringing Buddhism to London, but it'd be a bit less cool. Quite different. Most schools of Buddhism see a particular lifestyle or practice as being a real Buddhist. So in the Theravada tradition, to be a monk or a nun is to be a real Buddhist. In the Zen tradition, to have a particular kind of Zazen practice is what makes you a real Buddhist. In certain Tibetan schools, you need to have a particular kind of tantric initiation, then you're a real Buddhist. What's happening here is a sort of redefining of what makes someone a real Buddhist is something of their desire to be one and their effectiveness to practice accordingly, which I find really exciting. Often it gets talked about in terms of this kind of Triratna often talks about commitment primary, lifestyle secondary. Commitment primary, lifestyle secondary. And if you look around our order, the Triratna Order, there's about 3,000 of us across the world at the moment. People live very differently from one another. Some people do live a bit what would look like a monk. I've got a friend up in Scotland who lives in a cabin up in the woods and comes down 5 or 6 times a year to be part of a retreat. That's quite monastic. I've got another friend who lives with her husband, has 3 children, and is the director of fundraising for quite a large multinational charity. Quite sort of different, but on both cases there's this sense of going for refuge. I was thinking about this personally recently. So I came along to a Buddhist centre, a Triratna Buddhist centre, when I was 21. I'm 32 now, 33 next month. And I ended up spending I was really into it, basically. Yeah. I was 21, I went to do a 4-week meditation course just because I was stressed. I was in my final year of university studying theatre producing. I was asked to do a 10-year career plan, which I loved. I love planning. It was really good, really detailed, got quite high marks, pat on the back, all that, lovely. And then I remember taking it home and thinking, just having this existential crisis. It's like, oh, that's going to take me to 31. Right. I'll just be involved in assistant producing a West End show. And I'll probably have drunk a lot of wine You drink a lot of wine in the theatre world. Been really busy, really stressed. You know what I mean? I just sort of had I kind of fancied it, but I was sort of a bit like, now I've written it all out, what's the point? This sort of existential crisis, like what's the point of living my life now? It's all written down. I remember Googling it. I would have ChatGPT'd it if that was around. And Google sort of said, oh, it sounds like you need to live in the present. Have you thought about meditation? So then I typed in meditation, and the top hit was a 4-week course led by the London Buddhist Centre in Bethnal Green in the Quakers Meeting House in Westminster. So I did a 4-week meditation course, and it was particularly in the third week, the Metabhavana week, where we were learning this meditation practice to do with coming into a more positive relationship with oneself, not needing to sort of prove everything. You just deserve love. Can you turn that? Can you relate to yourself in that kind of way? I was like, no. Need to do this 10-year career plan, then people will like me. And then also this kind of radiating that love outwards. And crucially, I was being taught by a bloke, and quite a blokey bloke. Rough. I was a bit frightened of him. He looked a bit like a gangster, East End gangster. And I won't tell you his name because he might be watching it. He was saying, right, now I'm going to teach you the practice that cultivates love. I just thought, I didn't think men were supposed to talk like that, particularly not one that looks like you. And I just thought, I'm in. I was actually doing a course at a church at the time. I was doing the Alpha course, which is sort of like an entry to Anglican Christian thought. And I just had to write to them and be like, I wrote to them and said, I'm really sorry, I think I might be Buddhist. They were like, all right, fine. I went on a retreat. Anyway, so I was quite into it. So I quite quickly ended up living there and working there. So I moved into a men's community of 12 men, and I ended up working for the Buddhist Centre. I had worked in theatre for 3 years, and I sort of ditched it. Yeah, and I absolutely loved it. And then I also went for 3 years to live at Adasthana, a retreat centre in Herefordshire, where I was running the young Buddhist movement across Europe, so helping people in their 20s and early 30s run Buddhist groups across Europe in particular. So I lived at this retreat centre, but got to travel around, quite cool. Loved it. And then 2 or 3 years ago, I was, Ratna Prabhu, who was the chair of the North London Buddhist Centre, asked if I'd go on a walk with him. I knew him a bit. I thought he was going to ask me about young people, but he said, I wonder if you'd consider being the chair of the North London Buddhist Centre. I was like, no. Don't think so. Haven't been there before. Anyway, in the end, I become the chair of the North London Buddhist Centre. What also happened is I moved out of I'd lived in men's communities for 8 years, and I moved in with Julia, my girlfriend of 5 years, behind Holloway Road Stations, quite nearby. Quite a change of lifestyle. I'd lived as a Buddhist in the context of living with at least 10 other Buddhist men. Sometime at one point it went up to 16. You can see why I might have thought, I wonder if I could live with my girlfriend. But I sort of really loved living in these Buddhist communities for about 8 years, and it sort of shaped me in my 20s. And then I've embarked on my 30s being the chair here at the North London Buddhist Centre, so there is a Buddhist full-time context, and actually my partner Julia is also involved in our tradition. What I'm trying to get at is that actually there was something that I found quite difficult about that, because I was overly identifying with what a full-time Buddhist looked like was living in a community and working for Buddhism. Do you see what I mean? Because that's what I was doing. And I sort of had hardened around it. So then when I moved in with my girlfriend, there was this sense that I was doing something sort of wrong, or it is what I wanted and it was fine and it's completely fine, but there was this sense of like, it's not quite a full-time Buddhist anymore. Do you see what I mean? And I got a sense of how radical it is to keep steering back that, someone's dealing with it, don't worry, how radical it is to keep steering back to going for refuge rather than a lifestyle. I think it's actually quite hard. So whenever you have that moment of doubt, you've got nothing to kind of go, it's no good being like, well, I've got a bit of doubt around being a Buddhist, but I live in a community, so I'm fine. Or, well, I'm the chair of the North London Buddhist Centre, so I must be doing it right. That isn't what it's about. What it's about is, are you turning yourself towards the ideals of enlightenment, truth, and sort of friendship and love as much as you possibly can every day? That's what you have to ask yourself. I think it's quite a bit harder. And I think it's quite radical to drop the kind of accoutrements. So rather than wearing a robe and then like, I'm doing it. You have to keep kind of going back to something deeper. Is this making sense? You have to keep going back to something deeper. And I found when I changed my what looked like a very full-time Buddhist lifestyle, it rocked my confidence of whether I was doing it or not. And I thought that was fantastic. That was really, really good. I had to get back to the roots of what it's really about. So I think it's quite a demanding ordination that's been offered in Triratna, initially to the West, as part of this bringing Buddhism to the West. So in a way, with all of that, I've been trying to really emphasize that it's something of commitment to the ideals of Buddhism that makes someone a Buddhist, and that's what we mark with our ordination. Thoroughly exciting, radical principle. But quite often this phrase, commitment primary, lifestyle secondary, I think people can often hear commitment primary, lifestyle, or whatever. But secondary is still quite important. Secondary that's number 2. Commitment primary, lifestyle secondary, in brackets, still pretty important. And you really see this in the early years of bringing Buddhism to the West, the early years of Triratna, particularly in the early 70s. You get what's later called the 3 Cs. You get communities, cooperatives, and centres. So lots and lots of people start living together in communities. A lot of them initially, it's the 70s, they're squats. So a lot of people move into squats. A lot of people in the early years of Triratna are on, it was kind of UB40, wasn't it? You've got your unemployment benefit, and then you just work for the Buddhist centre. You live in a squat, state pays your wage, and then, maybe I shouldn't say that, they'll tell us off. The government will find us. But there was quite a sort of alternative tradition at the time of living in squats, not really worrying too much about money, sharing your food, particularly this world of cooperatives, people working together in equality and all owning the business. And those ideas are sort of picked up by Buddhism, by Triratna, by, at the time, the Western Buddhist Order, Friends of the Western Buddhist Order it's called, to kind of create these contexts to live in. Do you see what I mean? So commitment primary, lifestyle secondary, but how do we then express that commitment is the question that's being asked, particularly in the 70s in our movement. Let's try living together. Let's try going on retreat all the time. Let's try living on benefits and not working for money. Let's try setting up cooperatives. At one point, particularly down in Bethnal Green, there's a health food shop, a gift shop, a bookshop, 2 cafes, a restaurant, a typesetters. So doing this, sort of, you get all these Buddhists kind of working together, and they start calling it the new society. Sort of create this new society, this new community. Sometimes it's talked about as like a kind of Buddhist village. It's like a new society for people to participate in. These are shops and restaurants, and it's not just Buddhists coming in, but people are coming in and getting a taste of what it's like to be around some people trying to live from some ideals, not work for money, set up a cooperative, etc. So I think this kind of new society, this importance of livelihood is really important, and is another of the 6 distinct emphases of Triratna, our movement. Can sound quite odd. Triratna's emphasis on work can sound quite odd to traditional Buddhist movements, where the ideal is to become a monk, not work at all, and meditate and study all the time. But Sangharakshita, a quick quote, said that work is very important because if you're working, you're putting your energy into something with the result that that energy does not stagnate. If there is any sort of curse of monasticism in the East, and it's a real curse, it's simply stagnation and idleness. So there's this emphasis on work, on right livelihood, particularly on team-based right livelihood, working together in co-ops, communities, centres, this new society. There's even this talk of, at the time, there's a talk given by Bhante, by Sangharakshita, where he talks about work as the tantric guru. One of the tantric guru's roles in Tibetan Buddhism is to confront the disciple with their shortcomings and the true nature of things. And I think there's something about working in a context, particularly where people can reflect back what you're like, that can have that kind of confronting tantric kind of effect. Anyway, I've only got about 5 minutes left, and yes, I have mentioned 5 of the 6 distinct emphases of Triratna, but I haven't mentioned the 6th, which is spiritual friendship, Kalyana Mitrata. So running through everything I've been talking about this process of bringing Buddhism to the West, from Kalimpong to London, from talking about pioneering early order members to this friendship with Terry Delamere, from this ordination that witnessed another's effective going for refuge, or this aspect of working alongside others, all of them are shot through with spiritual friendship, kalyana mitrata, friendship with the beautiful. Yes, runs through everything I've talked about so far. So different teachers of different traditions had a connection, a friendship with Bhante, particularly in Kalimpong, and that created this sort of ecumenical approach, this sort of seeing Buddhism as a whole and trying to draw out the principles. That comes from connection with teachers that Sangharakshita look up to, kalyana mitrata, spiritual friendship. Even the emphasis on the importance of the arts. Whenever Sangharakshita, whenever Bhante talks about the arts, it's as if he's talking about friends, as if he's talking about his connection with Samuel Johnson, who made the first dictionary in the English language. It's almost like he's talking about a friend, or a poet, or William Blake. There's this sense of friendship, connection, kalyana mitrata, sort of through the ages. The principle of a unified order has within it the ideal that it's possible to be friends with anyone, particularly when you have a shared ideal. So I really found this when I spent time in India, meeting people from very, very different, very poor backgrounds in India. And very quickly we were friends, both order members. A unified order has friendship in it, the equality of ordination for all. Even this moment of in the ordination itself, it's all about one person, particularly someone with more experience, a sort of teacher with maybe a lowercase t, witnessing someone's effective going for refuge. It's about connection. Even this moment of ordination, effective going for refuge, is sort of witnessed through friendship. And right livelihood, as I was just talking about, of course, is all about working together in friendship. Yes, you end up with these 6 distinct emphases. Ecumenical approach, the importance of the arts, a unified order, the effective, commitment is primary, going for refuge is primary, right livelihood, and friendship. They're the 6 distinct emphases. That's what brought Buddhism to the West in this context, in Triratna. The Buddha famously, of course, said that spiritual friendship, beautiful companionship, is the whole of the spiritual life, the whole of the Dharma life. And I think that's what's been built over the last 58 years of Triratna. So mainly I've been talking about the early years of Sangharakshita, of Bhante, bringing Buddhism to the West, teaching in London. But it's only a few years later, so sort of 72, 73, that a few people head off with some tape recordings of his talks to Helsinki and Auckland. You get a sense of Triratna as not a very strategic organisation. It's very much based on a network of friends doing what moves them. I know where we'll go. Helsinki and Auckland, and Glasgow and Brighton. And then we'll have London, Brighton, and then Auckland, and then later someone's like, oh, I'll go to San Francisco, or I'll go to Germany. Becomes quite a large Buddhist movement in the UK and in India, fairly large New Zealand and Australia, and sort of beginning to grow. So there's a new group in Tokyo, for example. It's been 58 years since Bhante, since Sangharakshita brought Buddhism to the West in this form, in Triratna, with these distinct emphases. Yeah, and one of the reasons I particularly ended on that 6th emphasis of friendship, of spiritual friendship, is it's particularly unique in the Buddhist tradition. So when I've been to gatherings of other Buddhist schools, Triratna's known as the friendship one, the one where people work together, the one where there is a way for people to live together but not be monks, to work together on class teams, to run Buddhist centres, to be retreat teams together, to become mates. There's a close connection with the person that ordains you. They're not some guru from afar that you could project onto. You sort of know them really well. Quite a unique position. And I also want to end with it because personally I think it's the gift that I'm most grateful for. I think it's great that there's an ecumenical approach drawing on the essentials of Buddhism. I think it's great that I can work here at the North London Buddhist Centre because that's what I want to do, that there's this emphasis on right livelihood, that I've joined a unified order, that there's a commitment to the 3 jewels, that there's this emphasis on arts. But what I really love is that I went along to a meditation course at 21 to be a bit less stressed, and then saw a man that I thought I could look up to a bit, and I thought, aye, fancy a bit of that. What's he doing? And then I met other people that were willing to get to know me, and then I lived with them, and then I worked with them, and then I joined an order with them. In that way, other people have completely transformed my life, all because bringing Buddhism to the West, at least in this tradition, put a thoroughly strong emphasis on friendship, both sort of peer friendships, working together, but also this sense of vertical friendships, making sure there's some people to look up to, people you can get advice from, people you can learn from, and then people alongside you that you can practice with and do it with. Thoroughly sort of exciting. I think that's what we've formed over these 58 years as a network, a worldwide network of friendship, doing their best to sort of grow up. I like the kind of growing up for adults, doing their best to grow up, to work on their mind, to become more loving, and to sort of free their consciousness, all while having often a pretty good time. Anyway, so that's my talk on bringing Buddhism to the West.